giving people a moment to trickle in before we get started. Welcome, everyone. Okay, wonderful. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bullis. I'm the Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, the Sudan Military Coup, Resistance in the Face of State Brutality. Before we get started, our Executive Director, Rami Yaoub, would like to share a few words. Rami.
Thank you, Audrey. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Recently, Greek journalist Asteris Masouras tweeted something that really resonated with me. He said, "The Sudanese people mounted one of the most astonishing pacifist revolutions of contemporary times against the regime of a criminal against humanity," in reference to Omar al-Bashir. He then added, "only to be drowned in blood and to receive approximately zero reactions from the civilized world, with the exception of solidarity activists." Sadly, Asteris's words are painfully true. Sudan is often not paid the attention it deserves in policy discussions and discourse within the Beltway and beyond. TIMEP was founded over 9 years ago to amplify and defend voices for freedom and democracy within the MENA region. And while TIMEP started out with a heavy focus on Egypt, we have known since day one that the Institute would one day grow to become a regional hub and home for voices that deserve amplification, support, and protection across the region. Consistent with this dream and vision for growth, we continue along this path in a measured approach. And we are proud to be working on Sudan today. We are committed to dedicating TIMEP's resources to amplifying the voices of the Sudanese people. And we see that as part and parcel of our mission. In Washington, however, some are only inclined to engage when there is a strategic, security, or policy reason to do so. To those, I would like to echo the Atlantic Council's Kelsey Lilly's words from 2018. Sudan's strategic significance for U.S. policy on Africa, the Middle East, and counterterrorism cannot be overstated. And the country's unique geographic positioning puts it at the nexus between the Arab and African worlds. Further, Sudan maintains access to the Red Sea by the way of its long coastline and the transit hub at Port Sudan. Now, as we continue to see time and time again, including the war in Ukraine today, democratic societies and democratically elected governments and leaders make far more reliable allies, and they are willing to fight for their freedom and existence. The Sudanese people do so today at great personal expense, and I believe that they will continue to do so. We are proud to host this event at TIMEP, not only because this is a topic of utmost strategic importance, but more importantly, because it is a matter of moral imperative. Thank you, and back to you, Audrey.
Thank you, Rami. Before we begin today's discussion, I just want to remind our audience that today's conversation is being recorded. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag TIMEPEvents. And as audience members, we certainly invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function at any time. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Ismail Kushkush. Ismail is an independent journalist previously based in Khartoum for 8 years, and for 2 3-month periods in 2014 and again in 2015, he was the acting bureau chief for the New York Times in East Africa based in Nairobi, Kenya. He's covered political, economic, social, and cultural stories from Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Burundi, Sweden, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and the United States. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Rami. Greetings to all from wherever you're tuning in from. And thank you again for the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy for organizing this event, the Sudan Military Coup Resistance in the Face of State Brutality. In December 2018, Sudanese took to the streets in protests triggered by worsening economic conditions on top of a multitude of grievances, including dictatorship and prolonged wars in peripheral regions. In April 2019, dictator Omar al-Bashir of 30 years was toppled, but remnants of his old government remained in power. Protests continued to demand for a transition to full civilian rule. And the military came down brutally on protesters, epitomized in the crackdown at the sit-in in front of the army headquarters, or as it's known by its Arabic name, Al-Qiyada, on June 3rd, 2019, resulting in the death, killing of over 120, the rape of dozens, and the disappearance of many. Protests continued, and in August 2019, an agreement was reached between the civilian coalition of the forces known as the Forces for Freedom and Change and the Military Council, an agreement that was meant to guide Sudan's transition into democracy and the creation of a mixed military-civilian leadership. And the Sudanese United Nations bureaucrat, Abdullah Hamdok, was chosen as prime minister to lead this period. The transition saw some positive steps, including a widening of press freedoms, a peace agreement with rebel groups, the removal of Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and international engagement with Sudan. All, of course, not without some degrees of criticism and shortcomings. On October 25th, 2021, the military removed the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, dissolved the government, and created a new sovereignty council. Since October 2021, protests have continued in Sudan throughout the country, demanding a return to the move to full civilian rule. And over 80 have been killed since. For some, this has taken Sudan back to square one. To help us understand the challenges Sudan has faced since the 2018-2019 revolution and the October 2021 military takeover, we have a distinguished group of commentators and panelists. With us today are Dr. Sara Abdel-Jalil from the UK, a previous president of the UK branch of the Sudan Doctors Union, and a previous spokesperson for the Sudanese Professionals Association. Muzen Anil, an activist in Khartoum, a non-resident fellow of the Tahrir Institute. A lot of her work focuses on people-centric approach to economy, industry, and environment in Sudan. Professor Nasreen Al-Amin, an assistant professor of international studies at Bryn Mawr College. Much of her work focuses on land grabs, migration, and geopolitics in Sudan. And Dr. Bakr Al-Madani, associate professor of public policy and administration at the School of Business, Public Administration and Information Sciences, Long Island University, Brooklyn, New York. And a lot of his research is on governance and has been involved in Sudanese politics and civil society. We'll begin with Nasreen to give us some background on Sudan, the Sudanese revolution. For many in Sudan, the October 2021 military coup was not quite the surprise it was for the rest of the world. Could you please give us a brief background as to why the Sudanese people protested against Bashir in 2018-2019, how they organized, what was wrong with the agreement after Bashir's fall, which governed the status quo before the coup, and why some on the ground expected and indeed predicted such a takeover?
Sure, thank you so much. I want to start by paying tribute to the many martyrs of Sudan's ongoing revolution and to the sacrifices people have made to keep its momentum going. Sudan has a history of revolutions that toppled military regimes in 1964 and 1985, but I'd like to trace the genealogy of the December Revolution back to the 1950s. Britain's colonial parting gift to Sudan was an economy dependent on the extraction of raw materials like cotton, and a political system which was constructed to serve the interests of a central Sudanese ruling elite at the expense of other regions and of a rural population that sustained this extractive, export-oriented economy. Some of the initial forms of resistance against the new post-colonial state unsurprisingly came from tenant farmers who organized to demand, among other things, a greater share of profits as cotton prices plummeted. A strike took place on a cotton scheme near Kosti shortly after Sudan's independence in 1956. The state responded with extreme violence. Over 300 striking tenant farmers were shot or suffocated in poorly ventilated detention cells. A year earlier, Sudan's first civil war had broken out between South Sudanese demanding political representation and regional autonomy and the central government, who had essentially subsumed the South as a quasi-internal colony. This 1956 massacre is linked to the civil war because striking farmers were threatening existing capitalist labor relations that allowed ruling elites to extract maximum profits to fund its repressive campaign against southern rebels. And I highlight this moment because it reveals the way state violence in Sudan has long been shaped by the need to reproduce and maintain an extractive war economy that continues to serve elite interests by any means necessary. I'm going to fast forward to December of 2018, when some of the first protests emerged demanding regime change, first out of Damazin and then Atbara, led by industrial school students, disgruntled day laborers, etc., triggered by price hikes, a result of IMF-encouraged austerity measures, in a town known for its railroad worker organizing and history of resistance to colonial and post-colonial regimes, a place where the al-Bashir regime cracked down on this organizing, dismantling the union and laying off 4,000 railroad workers in 1991. Within days, the revolution spread to towns across the country before partially and eventually coalescing into a sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum in April, with over 1 million people participating to demand regime change and civilian rule. And these protests were preceded by protests in 2011, 2013, and 2016, which challenges this idea that Sudan was a latecomer to the Arab Spring. The sit-in created some of the pressure necessary to force Sudan's former military dictator Omar al-Bashir out after 30 years in power. After al-Bashir's ouster, military elites who had been part of his inner circle seized power, but the sit-in remained in place as a set of demands aimed at civilian rule, constitutional and legal reforms, demilitarizing the state, and stopping Sudan's ongoing wars were articulated by a coalition of civil society groups, unions, opposition parties, etc., called the Forces for Freedom and Change. And I'm going to skip over this next part because Ismail already talked about this. But in August of 2019, a partnership agreement between the FFC and the Military Council was signed, ushering in a 3-year transitional period with a constitutional document at its basis that ultimately proved unworkable. The civilian side of this transitional government was primarily made up of elite members of the FFC and technocrats with long careers at the UN, World Bank, etc. The appointed civilian Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, had been at the African Development Bank and the UN and focused on opening up Sudan to Euro and American interests and investments after decades in isolation. In an attempt to attract multilateral funding, he adopted neoliberal reforms that, in my view, deepened the economic crisis, even if economic indicators tell us otherwise. Because of the disproportionate power held by the Military Council in the transitional government, the national budgets that were adopted in 2020 and 21 reflected an increase in funding for Sudan's already bloated security sector and military, and decreases in social spending on health and education. During this transition period, we saw organized acts of civil disobedience across the country, from some of the longest worker strikes in Sudan's history to protests against the use of toxins in gold mining in places like South Kordofan. The revolution evolved in part because its most radical elements had been purposefully cut out of the transitional government. And that brings me to the military coup of October of 2021. Military elites currently control large sectors of Sudan's economy, approximately 250 companies in gold mining, wheat production, sesame, livestock, etc. And Hamdok was working towards having these companies be turned over to civilian-headed government ministries, just as leadership over the ruling council was to be handed over to a civilian. The Military Council, anticipating this, saw an opportunity to turn some of the leaders of armed opposition groups that had signed a peace agreement in 2020 in Juba and subsequently joined the government into allies as they planned their coup. The military junta has been in power ever since and faces intense, growing opposition from the streets, spearheaded by neighborhood resistance committees. The international community has ignored and undermined these committees by leading negotiations and supporting a fake partnership between the military junta and hand-picked civilians. As the popular resistance grows, the junta is escalating its violent tactics against protesters, and this violence is being legitimized and to an extent funded by their international allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, but also the US, Israel, and Russia, which has for several years now vied for a naval base along the Red Sea and smuggled Sudanese gold into Russia to fund their own military campaigns in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasreen, for that. We'll move on to Muzan in Khartoum. Muzan, you've worked and written extensively about the Sudanese the resistance committees in Sudan. Can you give us some background about the resistance committees? What are they? How do they come about? And how are they involved today? And what is their vision for the future?
Sure. Thank you, Ismail. Well, although the resistance committees actually appeared in 2013 and 2016 protests that Nasreen mentioned, the RCs were mainly formed in early 2019 at the beginning of the protests. They were formed of residents in the neighborhoods basically the residents who were committed to overthrowing the Bashir regime at the time. And they were created as an attempt to decentralize protests and thereby minimize the ability of the state oppression forces, be that the police or otherwise, to attack all the protests that take place simultaneously in different areas. After the massacre that the state forces committed on June 3rd, 2019 by attacking the sittings, 14 sittings simultaneously, not just the one in Khartoum, killing, injuring, and raping, and even drowning hundreds of civilians. And during the following month of violence, because the massacre was not a one-day event, there was an ongoing month of violence and also a full internet shutdown in the country. So during this time, the committees worked on the ground more, organizing for the June 30th march against the military and calling for a fully civilian government. And despite the violence and the internet shutdown, the march was huge. We had more than 7 million protesters all over the country on that day. However, those efforts were basically betrayed by the political leaderships, by the elite, the FFC, and the regional and international powers that forced a military-civilian partnership on the country. That was the transitional period, as Nasreen explained. Over this period, the committees walked a very fine line of advancing and calling for the objectives of the revolution. So that's freedom, peace, and justice. And that's criminal justice, social justice, and economic justice, of course, as they were also trying to preserve the fragile government of the partnership from an expected coup, basically. While the government kept on going against the goals of the revolution and advancing policies that are very similar to the policies of Bashir's governments that was overthrown in 2019. A major example of the situation between the government and the RCs and the resistance committees was the first budget. As Nasreen said, the first budget that was presented by the government of the partnership, it included the same economic liberalization policies and the desubsidization of basic goods, which ignited the protests in December 2018 to start with. So this budget caused a clear divide between the government and the grassroots, the resistance committees included. And then we have another example in the government's inability to put the military leaders on trial for the massacre of June 3rd. Because they are now part of the government, basically. So as the government kept drifting away from the objectives of the revolution and towards protecting the interests of the military and its regional allies and implementing IMF and World Bank futile policies that just made people poorer, the gap between the government and the resistance committees grew to the point that actually the last central protest that took place 4 days before the coup on October 21st, it was under the slogan of "Down with the Partnership of Blood," referring to the military-civilian partnership. After the coup, those committees organized the protests, and they are still ongoing, demanding power to the people and the military to the barricades, as the chant goes. And under the slogan of the 3 no's, that's no negotiation, no compromise, and no legitimacy, which basically sum up the lessons learned from 2019 about the futility of legitimizing and negotiating with the military coup. So it's actually thanks to these committees that and to the protesters in the streets that the coup is still not able to take full control of our lives in Sudan and not even able to form a government, despite the internal deals with the previous prime minister and despite the international maneuvers and dialogues with the coup. It's the protests that are keeping the who have taken full control of our lives. Now, although it was and still is the committees that are organizing and calling for these protests, we noticed that international and regional mainstream media ignored them for almost 2 months, saying that the protests were organized by the Sudanese Professional Association or the FFC, which are in realities bodies that almost have no weight or existence in the streets now. There are over 800 RCs in the capital alone. There are thousands more around Sudan. And what makes them unique, answering your question, is that they are rooted in the communities and the neighborhoods that they come from. They have coordinating bodies on state level, like not on the federal level, but on state level, but not a leadership that make decisions disconnected from the constituency or from the public. And that's why the policymakers and the media of the establishment are not able to put them in the usual frames, of leaders negotiating in closed rooms. And that's why they just ignore the existence of the RCs as much as possible, talking about bodies that no longer have an actual existence. The vision of the future of the RCs is very consistent with these roots. They are working for a system that restores power and wealth to the people, and both in the government structure as well as in the economic policies, basically.
Thank you, Muslim, for that introduction. And I think the Resistance Committee is definitely, I think, is one of the unique features of the Sudan Revolution in comparison to similar uprisings in the region, as is the Sudanese Professionals Association, which takes us to Dr. Sarah and Jalil in London. You've worked with both with the UK branch of the Sudan Doctors Union and the formation of the Sudanese Professionals Association. How did professional associations or syndicates play an important political role in Sudanese modern political history? And what vision do they have today and for the future of organizing in Sudan?
Thank you, Ismail, and thank you at Tahrir Institute for this opportunity. And let me join Nisreen in paying a tribute to the Sudanese people, the brave men and women who have given everything, their lives, and have faced torture and sexual violence in order for us to reach since 1948, even before the Sudan independence. And then there has been a very positive impact by the unions and the professionals and the workers, whether in the National Railways or Port Sudan or in the Jazeera scheme as farmers or doctors or engineers in 1964 and in the Sudan uprising in 1985. And the role was really important because they contributed to the community mobilization, whether they are participating, increasing awareness about the poor governance and the poor political system, and raising concerns about human rights, as well as by contributing to the peaceful resistance and the nonviolent movement in Sudan by contributing to strikes and civil disobedience. And in 1989, following the coup, it was different because Al-Inqaz, at that time it was not Al-Inqaz, they demolished all of the unions and they faced torture and detention and arrest. And one of the sad stories is the death of Ali Fadl, a doctor in the Sudan Doctors Union. During a strike in 1991, he died during torture, and therefore most of the independent union work was under the ground. This was replaced by pro-government unions that obviously were supporting the dictatorship and were not providing any sort of rights for their members. There has been an ongoing attempts to reestablish a union between all of these independent groups under the ground. However, there were several reasons why that was difficult. One of it was the sort of the National Intelligence Service, the detention, the arrest, but as well the huge privatization of the public sector. And this has led to, I would say, division and less connection between the workers and the professionals. However, since 2016 onwards, there has been different campaigns, and these campaigns have led to, the hope of forming another union and another coalition for different reasons. So they were working together in a cholera outbreak or dengue outbreak, or people were working together because of lack of life-saving medication, or standing with the teachers in their strike and their detention. And so building these networks led in 2018 to the formation of the Sudan Professional Association. It was low-key. The National Intelligence Services was not following and maybe not interested at that time. And they build sort of as well a momentum by asking and requesting about minimum wage and writing a scientific paper about the minimum wage in Sudan. I always say that the Sudan Professional Association responded to the people's voice. So as Nisreen have mentioned, it started at Damazin and started in different areas outside Khartoum. It was not a centralized movement. And the SPA responded to the people's movement and worked with at that time, the Neighbors Committee, as Muzen said. They were not all known to the National Intelligence Service. Maybe that helped in providing security. And they were supported by the other professionals in the diaspora, especially in areas of media and sort of raising concern. And we must admit, they did a good job. But then following April 2019, there has been a division about what should the SPA be doing. Maybe reestablishing the unions and paying attention to support the democratic transition at that time, the public sector, rather than playing the political part. Unfortunately, at the moment, the SPA, with all of different divisions, we can say that they are not playing as before, the strong, sort of part. However, we are still hoping that the independent unions and the independent committees that are around will be able to work together to support the pro-democracy group against the coup.
Thank you, Dr. Sadr, for that. Before our last panelist, just a reminder that we will be taking questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen after our next panelist. Dr. Bekri in New York, can you give us a brief overview of the political parties in Sudan? One of the outcomes of the revolution was the coalition known as the Forces for Freedom and Change. Can you give us some background about this coalition, the rebel movements, the various rebel movements in Sudan, and also a brief mentioning of the composition of the military council in Sudan that composes both of the army and the rapid support forces, and the role all these groups play, have played in the past 2 years and are playing at the moment?
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you, Rami, and thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Tahrir Institute, for the opportunity and the platform to talk to a wider audience about Sudan and Sudanese future. I also will join all the panelists and pay my tribute to fallen Sudanese martyrs and those who are injured. I also would like to salute women on this International Women's Day. Today is March 9th, and I could not have passed without saying something about that. I think, let me just say that whatever I'm going to say about Sudanese political parties is not going to be something different than the nature of the state. And if I have to add one thing to Nasreen's outstanding opening, the extractive nature of Sudanese state is it's in DNA. It's 1821, not even 1955. The structure of the current Sudanese state is an extractive one, and it's built on oppression and actually slavery and extracting whatever available. So in 1955, the state that we inherited from the post-colonial state has things that is different than continuing the same with the same intended mechanisms. Unfortunately, Sudan failed completely to develop any national agenda or national project. And the state we have has always been a post-colonial state that is functioning with a post-colonial mind, and it never really developed any things that is related to Sudan. So to say that, I could point to we never had a permanent constitution. We never ever had a consensus that brings all Sudanese people together. All what we had is a quasi process that looked very centralized. And I can go even further, and I even say, we don't even have a state in Sudan. What we have is a process of the state in the making, if we really want to name things the way they should be named. So if you take that context as a way you could approach political parties, what we have is historically Sudan has two main traditional parties, and that is probably, if you really think about lots of countries similar to Sudan, this dichotomy between modernization and tradition has always been around. In 1940s, we have a few educated Sudanese who could have tried to develop the country in a different path. And I can take you back to 1940s, and that was the first graduates, they called them the Graduates Conference. These are University of Khartoum or Gordon College back then graduates, and some of them from other universities in the region. They decided to find the existing social mechanisms to actually elevate themselves to leadership. And what they did, they joined sectarian groups. We have something called Khatmiya, and we have Ummah Party, which is Khatmiya and Ansar are both of them have deep history in Sudanese social making. These are sectarian Sufi groups. And the dynamic between modernization and traditionalism actually started there. So the biggest two parties eventually were created as a result of educated people, educated Sudanese graduates who decided to find a shortcut to power. So what did they do? They joined these traditional sectarian groups, and they established political parties, and that really became the DNA of Sudanese politics for a long time. These are the two major parties. Of course, we did have a Sudanese Communist Party. It has always been small but influential, but it never really did take roots in this modernization programs that we could talk about. All of this took place in the absence of a state, in absence of a national agenda. And of course, if you have to really think about it, within the last, Sudan is now independent for a good 62 years, and 56 of them has been in the military. So it's really hard to talk about the political party in Sudan without mentioning the fact that they spent most of their time under oppression, fighting dictatorship. And if you want to put it like in terms of names, yes, there is a Ummah Party, which also divided multiple times. There is the United, what is it called, a United Democratic Party, which also went through multiple divisions. And then you have small groups. Of course, there's Communist Party. And the Coalition of Freedom for Forces and Change, it wasn't really the first attempt. I can take you back to 1990. This is about 6 months after the coup d'etat of 1989. The Sudanese political parties joined together and they established the National Democratic Alliance. That was the beginning of building a larger, broader coalition of the opposition. It was established in Sudan, and they later moved to Egypt. They led an opposition from exile. This took all the way until 1990s. At the time, they even adopted sort of what you could say a mixture of military action and political action, and they joined with the SPLM. At the time, SPLM was fighting the government in Khartoum in a major conference in Asmara in 1995. Then all of that actually came to end by signing the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. And that was the beginning of really it's a big challenge because the 2005 gave the Bashir and the Islamists the legitimacy to be speaking on behalf of the North, and it gives the SPLM the legitimacy to be speaking on behalf of the South. Political parties in Sudan completely lost their focus, and they couldn't really develop any clear program about what they want to do in terms of fighting for democracy. This continued until 2011. Then the South decided to, people from South Sudan, they voted for separation, and they established the Southern State. And that really opens the door for a new thinking about what kind of political coalition can we develop. Of course, I don't have to forget at that time, we have some groups, military groups in Darfur. There is, I can tell you, maybe 4 or 5 major ones. And over time, since 2003, that's the beginning of when people started to carry arms and fight against the central government in Darfur. We have seen at least 16 military group with different names, different shapes. Sometimes they start, they disappear, they reform. And that has been part of the nature of the military groups, which is really complicating the scene as we speak. If we really have to come back and say, who are the active players? We have some military groups who signed the Juba Peace Agreement, and now they are part of the government that is sitting in Khartoum. Then we have the traditional Sudanese parties, and these are Ummah Party. Then we have National Democratic Party with many different factions. Then you have Sudanese Congress Party, a small emerging party established in 2004. Then you have so many small groups. And the coalition came out in February 2019 as a way to really culminate and I have to say, I'm not really going to give you a whole history of how these different coalitions formed, but NDA was one. At some point, we have something called the New Dawn. And at some point, Sudanese political parties also create something called I think the Salvation Front. And all of that actually was the same groups going around forming coalitions, and it fails, and then it comes back. And probably one thing that I have to note, the Forces for Freedom of Change is the largest political coalition that has ever been developed in the history of Sudan. And the beauty, or maybe the chemistry of success, it wasn't purely political parties. It was political parties, it was professional associations, syndicates, labor unions, and that actually provided, I would say, the last push that needed for the revolution to succeed in April 2019. As we speak, these groups exist, but they are really divided. We have to put things, there is a coalition remaining from Freedom and Forces and Change. There are 4 major parties. You could say there is Ba'ath parties, there is Sudan Congress parties, there is Ummah Party, and there is different factions of Union Democratic Party. There is a Communist Party. It's also playing a role, but it's an opposition, not at the moment part of that coalition. If I have to take the second part of your question, and I know I've taken a long time to kind of really answer a long question, right, is the nature of the military council. The military council we have right now is basically, you could say it's made of Sudan armed forces. And I would be lying if I have to say this is just a facade. That's a name of what we can call the hijacked institutions. The Sudan's armed forces is a hijacked institution. Yes, there are some Sudanese who are wearing some military uniform speaking on its behalf, but it doesn't represent what Sudan's armed forces should look like. And then you got the Rapid Support Forces. I think people might know, if they don't know, Rapid Support Forces is the quasi militia that exists within, parallel to the state. You could say it is part of the Sudanese army, but it's not. It's because it has its own law. It doesn't belong to, it doesn't really fall under the command of the Minister of Defense. It's part of the Minister of Defense according to the law. But its own leader, which is, as we speak, the General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, is the only person who could command that force. And according to the law, so the military, part of the military faction of the government is made of these 2 groups. And of course, if we have to count the rebel groups as military groups, then you really have about 3 major other groups. But you can't really count them as part of the military council because they are part of the government as a result of Juba peace agreement.
As a result of the peace agreement with the UN. We'll get back to some of this. I know this is complicated for those who don't follow Sudan closely, but this is at least to give you a sense of how complex the Sudanese political scene is and with the various players. I have another round of questions. I hope we can just have some brief answers as to some of the outlook of that has been for the past few months and for what is to come. Muzaddin Khartoum, can you briefly talk to us about the economic grievances and demands of protesters that are held today, and to what extent are these demands can realistically be realized? In addition, can you talk to us about popular perspectives on the freezing of World Bank and international assistance programs following the coup?
Sure. Well, as Nasreen explained, the economic demands are in the heart of every conflict that took place in Sudan. That the structure of the economy, the rentier economy, the post-colonial setup of the state that we have led to every conflict we have. Now, the 2018 process, as has been said before, were ignited by an increase in the price of bread. So from 1 Sudanese pound for a loaf of bread, it went to 2 pounds, and that's what started the first protest to some extent. Now, by the time of the coup, after 2 years of the transitional period, a loaf of bread was priced at 20 pounds. So that's 10 times the price that ignited the protest. I think this simple example shows how far the transitional government actually drifted from the economic demands of the people. The economic situation in Sudan, to start with, was catastrophic. So you have 60% under the poverty line, 40% of the youth are unemployed. And in 2021, we had 150% increase in cost of living over 1 year, 300% inflation. This is a situation that definitely preceded the transitional government. However, it was also exacerbated by the policies of the transitional government under the justification that this is needed to proceed with debt relief, and as it was dictated by international monetary institutions. So let me start by the second question regarding the international monetary institutions and their assistance or grants. So in an article that was published in Al Jazeera English a couple of weeks ago by Matt Nashed, where he talks about the impacts of the coup on the health system in Sudan. And he mentions statements by health professionals who say that the availability of medical supplies was somewhat improved under the transitional government, but the government also imposed the IMF advised austerity measures that made medications unaffordable for many anyway. So this sums up actually the story of international assistance, grants, and loans. They do provide microscopic bandages for huge wounds that was caused by the policies that they enforce on nations. This is true to Sudan and true to many developing countries as well. The people of Sudan are demanding a state that prioritizes their economic needs, free healthcare and education as a right. That's what people chant, and providing food and basic goods in prices that they can afford, providing decent employment, spending on infrastructure and development for the people. And this, of course, is it contradicts with what the World Bank and the IMF advocates for, which is the total forego of the economic responsibilities of the state towards the people and a total free market economy. Let me just give you a concrete example of something that is taking place right now. Since the first week of January, we have farmers in North Sudan. They've been closing the road with barricade. That's the main road linking Sudan and Egypt, in opposition of a 500% hike in electricity tariff. Their demands now are not just only about the tariff, but also include building hospitals, getting their fair share of the revenues of the gold that is extracted from their own lands, and a fully civilian government that is accountable to them and thereby will provide their demands in a sustainable manner. Now, this same hike was actually announced by the transitional government prior to the coup, and it was praised by the head of the World Bank in his visit to Sudan last September. And it would have been, would have been the same economic disaster to people in case it was enforced by the transitional government or as it comes now by the coup, but maybe at that time it would have came with the futile bandages of the World Bank that helps no one, and then get used by the government and its allies basically as tools of propaganda under the slogan of economic reform. So it is very clear to us that the ways of the IMF and the World Bank cannot realistically lead to economic justice in any chance in Sudan, and it never did, not in any country that we know of, not in any developing country. And Sudan will never be able to provide the needs of its people if it's keep exporting raw and unprocessed materials to industrial countries and foregoing the provision of basic services to its people. And that's why achieving justice requires a different economic model, a model that advances industrialization, advances people-centered economic policies. And this is also the only way that we can realistically achieve peace and stability in the country, since all the wars, as Nisreen explained, and all the conflicts were actually started from injustices in wealth distribution. That's why the way of the resistance is the realistic one, while the way of the IMF, the World Bank, and the international community are just lies on top of each other.
We'll come back to that in further questions. Nisreen, international mediation, particularly by the United Nations and Western governments in Sudan, after the military takeover in October of last year, have been met with disinterest by many organizers. Can you comment on that? What do you think the international community or international players are not getting about Sudan, and why is there resistance to these efforts?
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to take like a minute to do this because I want us to get to the questions. But I want to actually answer this question by reading the Quad's, so this is Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, UK, and US's statement on these sort of facilitating discussions to resolve Sudan's political crisis. So the UN Interim Transitional Assistance Mission, UNITAMS, has been facilitating these discussions, and the Quad says, we strongly support this UN-facilitated Sudanese-led dialogue initiative. We urge all Sudanese political actors to seize this opportunity to restore the country's transition to civilian democracy in line with the 2019 Constitutional Declaration, and we look forward to this being a results-oriented process that will guide the country towards democratic elections in line with the Sudanese people's manifest aspirations for freedom, democracy, peace, justice, prosperity, and stability. So there are a couple of things here. One, this return, right, to a process that proved a failure, essentially, based on a constitutional declaration that proved to be unworkable, is a problem. The fact, I mean, it's ignoring entirely the call for no negotiations, no partnership, no bargaining with the junta. And it's really, the priority right now should be overthrowing the military council, removing the military from the political process, and negotiations within this context is really just legitimizing the coup. And resources are being poured into not only legitimizing the coup regime, but also funding the state violence necessary to kind of protect this legitimization, if you will. And so for me, I think, what does that imply? I'm not like a Washington think tank kind of person. My inclination would be to say hands off. I think we need to think about, there've been several military coups across the Sahel, the latest being in Burkina Faso, and they come also as a result of these kind of investments through the war on terror in the already bloated security sectors of various African nations that then lead to these coups. And so to me, it's about divesting and really marginalizing the military rather than aggrandizing and sort of legitimizing its hold not only on sort of political power, but also economic power.
Great. And I think we might revisit this.
Ismail, if I may jump on this, just to add a few things.
If we can, because I think there's a question that addresses this, and I think we could all
sure.
be together. but because I do want to get to a few points before opening up for questions and answers. Dr. Bakri, what is the regional role in the military takeover? We know that countries such as Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, South Sudan do have interest in what is happening in Sudan and have interest in perhaps supporting one circle or perceived partner or the other. Can you talk about the regional and international role in events in Sudan?
Okay, thank you, Ismail. I'll try to be specific. Let me start by stating out, complaining about what the regional players will do in Sudan is not an advanced political thinking, in my opinion. And I know a lot of Sudanese people have been criticizing regional party, players, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Ethiopia, and South Sudan, and
let me add Israel also.
Israel, of course. I think it goes without saying, we live in a globalized world, and if you really want to play, you have to be part of that game. Complaining about what they do to you is good and ethical, morally grounded thing to do, but it's not a political position. And I think that's what Sudanese political movement at this moment lacking in terms of what exactly do we need to do to develop a mature discourse that we can take to regional players. So if the question is about what they do, of course, Sudan is a huge country. It has lots of resources, some of it gold, and I've spoken and written about this extensively. As a hijacked state, it's a lot easier to control it by having agents. If you really think about the exports, Sudan exports about what, $3 million? This is $3 billion in exports. It's sesame, gold, a little bit of used to be oil. Then you get groundnuts. If you think about our exports, really, where do they go? They end up in some of these regional countries, and then livestock. I don't have to forget. So regional players are always going to think about what interest do they have in the country and how do they work to get it. At the moment, I think Sudan is so weakened and hijacked to the extent the country could actually collapse in a brink. So maybe a reasonable discourse that we could say to our brothers and sisters in Egypt, whatever you want from Sudan as part of your national security agenda probably can be worked out in a reasonable discourse that takes into account Sudanese people priorities as well. So Egypt has an interest in Sudan, Saudi Arabia has an interest in Sudan.
Yes, if you can pinpoint to the audience, like what are those interests that, say, Egypt might have in Sudan or Saudi Arabia or Israel? How should followers of Sudan interest? What are those interests?
To begin with, for Egypt, Egypt is a neighboring country to the north of Sudan, and Sudan does a lot of, I could say, unofficial trading that doesn't really go into the books. These are huge exports that they go to Egypt and they get re-exported as if they are Egyptian exports. Of course, this is allowed, by the way. Internationally, it's okay to import something from another country and you can export it as long as you take care of some called added value. You have to do some added value to the product. So you will be amazed to find that there are lots of Egypt export sesame, Egypt export meat, livestock, and none of these things are produced in Egypt. So there is something like that. You go to Emirates. Emirates is one of the exporters of gold. I haven't seen any gold mines in Emirates. Saudi Arabia is receiving a lot of Sudanese livestock. So, and it's also national security issues. Israel, to tell you frankly, I think Sudanese political leadership has been played. They don't really have any direct interest with Israel beyond providing an acceptance for Israel in the region. And Sudan is being used by some regional players to placate, to make the idea of, to normalize Israel in the region for other countries, not for the sake of Sudan itself, as far as I know, as we speak. So countries do have interest in Sudan. The question is, how do you manage that interest beyond complaining about it is a challenge that Sudanese people need to rise up to and have an answer.
I think we might also revisit some of these topics in the Q&A. Dr. Sarra, you are part of the Sudanese diaspora. what role has the Sudanese diaspora played a big role or an important role in the Sudanese revolution? What role do you see post the military takeover of October 2021 today?
Yes, so the Sudanese diaspora played a major role, whether they are second generation, first generation, or whatever. There has been an intergenerational, transnational support for the revolution and for the transitional period. And this was provided in different ways. The reasons why people left Sudan is not different from other reasons why other diaspora. Genocide, human rights violation, crimes against humanity, economical crisis, political crisis, and social. Few for career progress and training. But the difference in 1980s following the Sudan uprising, quite a few number of the Sudanese diaspora returned back home. This time, this never happened because there was this apprehension about this partnership with the military council and the concerns that actually our dream will not be achieved. And that what happened on the 25th. But the diaspora played different roles, and I'll just give some examples. If we talk about the doctors, for example, whether that's the Sudan Doctors Union, the Central Committee, or the Unified Doctors Office, there was a lot of sharing about the human rights violation, the types of injury, the casualties, and there was support to the emergency support for the peaceful protesters because there was no pre-hospital care. There is no way to support those who were injured, and they were fatal injuries. But the role about raising these casualties in the European Union Parliament, in the Geneva Human Rights Council, in the Congress in America or in Australia was really very important and very strong message, and it verified the human rights violation that the government was trying to hide. This is the same now after the 25th. As you said, 80 were killed. They were mainly youth under the age of 30. Some of them were children under the age of 18 years old. The injuries were mainly to the chest, to the neck, to the head. There were, maybe 13 or more who were raped on the 19th of December. But there has been an ongoing human rights violation. And so the diaspora played a role, whether they're from the legal human rights defense, to reach out to the right organizations to sort of be the voice. Another way was the donation, and the donation, as I said, whether for the emergency support, the donation for those who were injured, for the rehab, different types of money donation. And as well, there was a lot of advocacy as well as lobbying with policymakers, for example, the DFCO, the Foreign Office in the UK or in other countries, and trying to reach out to the media and talk about what's happening in Sudan. As Musa said at the beginning, there was this question about in the media is what is different on 2018? It's all about bread and petrol and everybody will go back home. And we went in and said, no, it's not about bread and petrol. This is a true movement for change, not for reform and not just for bread. At the moment, we can see that the diaspora are reorganizing themselves once again, and they're trying to reach out. But as we have discussed, and as you have mentioned, Sudan is out of focus. People are not paying attention to what's been happening in Sudan, despite that we are very proud of this peaceful resistance that is facing a very brutal, cruel regime that's coming back on the 25th of October, 2021.
Thank you, Dr. Sadra. Before we go to Q&A, I just have one question. And I would imagine this will also be in the QA, but if we were to critique the transitional period, what do you think are the major shortcomings of the period, including from the government itself, the government of Abdullah Hamdok, the former prime minister? What do you think the shortcomings were? And I think that there are a number of issues that we can get into with the Q&A, but I think this is also an important point to reflect on. and this is open for anyone who wants to. I mean, I'm sure this can be discussed widely, but I think if we were to point to some key problems with the transitional period, what do you think they were? Muzan.
I'm happy to point two areas which I think were major issues. One of them is that there was no parliament to monitor and to be like the people's voice, and whether that was intentional. And this have obviously made the military club more stronger in making a lot of decisions. The second part, there was lack of governance in the structure of the transitional government, whether that's the executive or the judiciary or the different sort of policies. There was lack of governance, and there was nobody there to hold them account about transparency and accountability and citizenship participation. And the whole point about the revolution was about citizenship participation and having everybody contributing to the revolution.
Right, thank you. Let's
well, I'll add to that. Sorry, Ismail. I'll add to that as Dr. Sarah said, there are so many shortcomings of the governments, and whether it's the anti-people economic liberalization policies, the Juba peace agreement between basically leaders who were bought by seats in the governments with no regard to the demands of the people in war and conflict areas, and what the Juba peace agreement, as I think Nisreen and Dr. Bakri mentioned, how those leaders participated and contributed to the coup. But in reality, all these shortcomings are rooted in the nature and the birth of the government. It is a partnership between the military, drawing support from its weapons, and regional anti-democratic regimes, that's the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, the Israeli occupation in Palestine, and between civilian leadership, elites who are drawing support from anti-people monetary institutions and loan shark countries of the Paris Club. So, of course, this government will obstruct justice for the crimes that were done and committed by the members of the government. And, of course, it will advance policies that serve the interest of its supporters, basically by integrating Sudan in the global supply chain as a cheap raw material provider with no economic sovereignty whatsoever, and thereby no ability to provide for the economic justice for its people, leading to no stability and leading to no sustainable peace. And that's why the situation was horrible. It was unreformable, and any attempt to restore something similar or use a similar process with the fake label of civilian-led government or anything else is just a repeat of the same criminal absurdity, basically. If we are seeking justice, be that whether it's criminal justice, whether it's social or economic justice, that requires actual liberation of the state from the capture of the counter-revolution, internal and international parties. So Sudan can have then a government that is accountable to its people and to their needs, and to achieve an economic development via industrialization and generate the wealth that is necessary for the people to stop dying of poverty and of treatable diseases. And anything that doesn't start there is just another futile bandage. And I have to come here and just address what Dr. Bakri mentioned a few seconds ago regarding complaining to the international community regarding their evil doing. And of course, that statement is definitely true if our point of critiquing the international and regional governments is to shame them into being better people. But that's not the situation, right? I mean, we remember the contradiction between the Blues for Sudan campaign that was done by people on the ground all over the world that kept us on the map, on the political map and on the news map during the month that we were under total internet shutdown in Sudan, and between what the international governments did by then forcing a constitutional crime on us by the transitional government and the military-civilian partnership. So we are not in any way saying what we're saying and exposing the truth to supporters partners and allies around the world because we want to complain regarding what the international governments are doing. They're doing what their system requires to keep us as raw material provider with no sovereignty whatsoever. But we believe that there are people, the constituency that of those governments who are have representatives in those governments who are our allies, who do have an interest in the liberation of the Sudanese people, and therefore will support us and will stop their governments from basically harming us further by pushing this counter revolution on us.
Right. We have a long list of questions. I want to go to the audience's questions and get some of this, and I'll try to lump some of these questions together and also come to some of the points that we did not get. Again, this is a large thing, and I thank all of you for your input. One question is, how is it possible to develop policies beyond only protesting? It is difficult at the moment to see an opening or possibility for change in which the security apparatus changes and in which these contentious relations with some Gulf countries and Russia, for example, can be changed in a very practical manner. Whoever would like to take that beyond protesting, what are some of the practical means you see that could change the situation on the ground?
If I may take on this question, just basically stating what we are seeing. What we are seeing right now, in addition to the process, is that resistance committees all over the country are putting out proposals for political declarations. And those political declarations include kind of roadmaps towards how they see the way towards putting in place a government that represents them and how they think this government should govern the country. And one of the most important parts of those declarations and roadmaps is building the new structure of the state from the ground up. So starting from local councils, electing local councils, municipality level, and then state councils to the federal legislative body that then appoints the prime minister who selects his government and so on. So this is a peaceful manner in which basically what you're doing is that you're taking the space of the state. You're taking over the power. Like that's basically the concept of dual power, bringing it right back from the 1920s. It seems that it still works. That this is the only way to peacefully remove a regime. Any other way, the ways that are put out by the international community are basically to negotiate with it, and we saw how that ends, and that will not lead to any kind of change. So what the Sudanese people are doing right now, with starting from this, building the structure of the state from the ground up, is that they are kicking the military out of out of power. Basically, if that is to happen, that will be the most practical and, in my opinion, the only realistic way to peaceful regime change.
Thank you for that answer. One theme that repeats itself in many of the questions that were presented is the role of Russia. We know that the chair of the Rapid Support Forces, known by his nickname Hamati, was in Russia on the first day of what happened to be the first day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What role does Russia play now in Sudan? And how is that relationship going to affect the politics of Sudan? Perhaps Nisreen or Bakri would like to take that question.
I can speak to it, then Nasreen maybe you can finish. This is a complicated moment for Sudan, because not just we have revolutions that really survived some of the most difficult international, sort of not really covering it, not talking about it. But also attention is going somewhere else, and the whole world is going through, I don't want to be like the one who predict like big things, but I would say second wave of Cold War is among us. It's obvious. And Russia, what Russia is doing in Sudan is nothing, it's not really new. This has been going on for a few years now. And it started in the region. And Russia is using Wagner. This is private companies that is very close to Putin. as we speak, there are 3,500 Russian soldiers in Khartoum, in Sudan. They are managing the supply chain for rapid support forces. They are providing intelligence. They are actually, before the coup of October 25th, they bought 6 million accounts from Facebook. These are all Russian accounts. And they are leading the campaign to create division and to create lots of fights among activists themselves sometimes, because you don't know who's commenting in these platforms. They are using the same playbooks they use in the United States during the election of 2020. So Russia's role in Sudan is huge, and it's not just Sudan. You have to see it in a geopolitical context. Russia did the same thing in Central African Republic. It did the same thing in Niger. And what really Putin is doing is creating kleptocracies, create a small government that is going to be controlled by some military strongmen who are going to extract resources and keep everybody's mouth shut. Of course, in terms of the idea of getting a military base in Red Sea, lots of people think this is something Bashir started. I don't even think this is what the Russian wants. I think what Putin wants is to use Sudan as a bargaining chip in his larger global game about how do you chip power from this or from that one. To that end, there is also some material value. I know that from many papers I've read and report that is circulating, the long-term plan for Putin and China is to weaken the United States, and they think the way you do it is to weaken the dollar. And one way to do this is by trying to get your hands I don't know economically if it's going to work. There are lots of theories about it's not going to do anything in terms of the international trade and how things are. And in that sense, getting gold from Sudan is one thing. Also getting money. There are some news. I would say I need to find out if it's true. There is about 5 billion of the Sudanese military industrial complex or conglomerates. This is managed by Russian companies in offshoring accounts. The connection between Russia and Emirates is very strong because of gold. We have seen what UAE did in abstaining and not voting against condemning Russia. So it's a really complicated geopolitical web Russia is playing a role in, and unfortunately, Sudan happened to be a weak state, and it's being hijacked by its own people, but also aided by some Russian mercenaries.
I want to piggyback on that. Again, lumping some questions together, but on the regional element in events in Sudan, one regional issue definitely that has consumed policymakers is the establishment of the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and this has been a part of negotiations between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. How has the military takeover impacted those negotiations, do you think? What kind of relationship has that impacted Sudan's relationship with either Ethiopia, with Egypt? And along with that, the current war in the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia, how have these issues affected the politics in Khartoum? Maybe Nasreen, would you like to address that?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I will say that I think Al-Burhan has proven a more reliable ally to Sisi based on his own kind of military training in Egypt and relationship with him. And I think part of that has meant that Sudan has sided more strongly with Egypt in this kind of negotiations around not the construction of the dam, but the filling of the dam and the degree to which it gets filled, because it'll obviously have an impact on Egypt, to a lesser degree on Sudanese farming. And I think one indication of this is the way that right after the coup, if I'm not mistaken, there was a kind of militarization along, like from the Sudanese coup regime of the border between Ethiopia and Sudan, and I think that sort of is an indication of kind of a more rising hostility in relationship to Ethiopia, which I think is important for us to keep in mind, particularly given what is happening in the Tigray region.
Thank you for that. A question here, comparing events in Sudan to perhaps parallels in Tunisia. In Tunisia, we're heading into an IMF deal that will basically make it impossible for most Tunisians to have a form of dignified life, cutting subsidies of basic goods, but with a very popular president in place. Kais Saied managed to frame it all as a needed solution to get out of the financial trouble we're in. And suddenly, the socioeconomic reality is not the responsibility of literally the only person in charge politically. How do you keep the economic angle alive in political resistance and public debate in Sudan, with state propaganda and international interest pushing against it? What lessons to keep in mind?
Let me try to answer that, Ismail.
Yeah.
That we've dealt with the horrors of IMF propaganda for a while over here in Sudan. If there's one thing that we learned over the past 2 years, and even after the coup, is propaganda is mightier than a gun. Definitely. We saw how the same policies were easily passed by the propaganda of the transitional government, while the coup could not pass it with all its guns. People kept protesting, but propaganda is definitely mightier. It took a lot of work in Sudan for resistance committees in neighborhoods. And at that time in 2020, we had even resistance committees that were stronger in institutions, including the public sector institutions, to push against the budget that the government put at first, which was horrible. It killed more people. It would have killed more people than their latest budget actually killed. If there is a lesson, is that, as I said, propaganda is mighty. You'll put out the right messages forever, and they will be rejected. Your chances, at least this is what we saw. Our chances of actually getting action within the first round of austerity, of getting actual support, popular support within the first round of austerity with the popular government, is very difficult. But it is the seeds that you lay in that first round that come back, because it cannot work. We know that the IMF policies will never work, and people will see it, and people will be unfortunately hurt by it. But that hurt will remind them of the messages, that the actual economic messages that were put first, and you get more chance to advance more pro-people economic policies. That's the one thing we kept doing. We just kept going in rounds with against the IMF and its clients in the country, whether it's the Prime Minister Hamdok or whoever else in his cabinet, and every time you win more people. I will just take a couple of more minutes to add to a previous question that we had regarding the international community and what it's doing in Sudan, that I think is very important. I think it's important to remember that when the UN mission invited the RCs to meetings, the RCs requested live broadcasting of the meeting by the simple tool of a Facebook Live from their personal accounts. And the UN mission refused. It was a shameless display of their anti-democratic and anti-transparency ways, which clearly shows that they are not interested in a community dialogue, and that's what they keep saying, but in closed room negotiations that are designed to co-opt and corrupt the resistance. And as Dr. Bakri said, this is the most expected from basically Western diplomats to keep on pushing for the model that serves them better, right? For keeping Sudan as a poor provider of cheap raw material, it's understandable they will try to reinforce the flawed model that served them and serve those interests, and not the model that the resistance committees are pushing for. And that's why I have to say that the approach of trying to find a common interests with whether with the loan shark countries of Paris Club or with the the other counter-revolutionary regional neighbors that we have, it just makes no sense, honestly, because so if we get a Sisi against Burhan, what kind of a government will a Sisi support to have in Sudan? I don't think it's exactly the kind of government that will industrialize the country and instead of shipping the raw material to him, keep the people alive. If our interest is to keep the people alive, this approach should not be an option, in my opinion. That is very important to put out.
I want to bring up one issue that we did not discuss, but I think is extremely relevant to this discussion, and that is the question of justice for the families of the victims of many of the atrocities that have taken place. Probably most notably is the June 3rd sit-in massacre, or Al-Qiyada as it is known by its Arabic name, and the freezing of the efforts of the investigation. What do you, how do you see justice moving forward in Sudan for the victims of these various atrocities? And this, of course, is not to forget in any ways those connected to other atrocities, whether they be in Darfur or other regions in Sudan. But I think the question of justice and where is justice moving and achieving justice for Sudanese. Anyone who would like to take that?
I can start, and I think other colleagues can join. The revolution is mainly about achieving justice in different aspects. And as we have discussed, there are some areas that people feel it has been ongoing for decades and years and years. And we as a nation stood together and, you know, planning that we have to move on and we have to achieve justice. But the partnership with the military was very clear that there was no commitment. They were not genuine. That we could not dismantle the previous regime. We could not build the infrastructure for the judiciary system, for, you know, even trying to, there was a window of freedom, a narrow window of freedom after the revolution, but the genuine sort of justice achievement, it was still a struggle. Basically, Omar al-Bashir until now is not facing trial, whether that's hybrid, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Lahai, whatever. This was very symbolic, very important for all of us in Sudan, because we have been going in and out of military coup, short period of democracy, military coup, and we want to show that there is accountability for those who made these crimes. We couldn't achieve that. There was a lot of explanation and a lot of trial to prevent that. If you look at you know, the investigation for June massacre, as one of my colleagues mentioned, it was not only in Al-Qiyada. There were 11 cities invaded by the RSF, Janjaweed, between two brackets. And the investigation has not been completed 2 years down the line. And justice was not achieved. And if I move from the legal justice to the social justice, still people are dying because they don't have access to health. Still education is mainly a private service. No infrastructure. People are suffering with basic needs. So it was a big frustration and disappointment for all of us, you know, with the precious price that people have paid, their lives, that justice was not achieved. And it was very clear that this will not happen because this partnership from the beginning was not going to be successful.
Thank you, Dr. Saad, for that. We're approaching the end of this program, and again, there are many questions, and I know we cannot get to all of them. And the Sudanese political scene is complex and big, and with many players. But if you can all give a very brief concluding remark, where do you think things are going? Whether as you see them in Sudan, and given also just globally, as the attention moves from one region to the other, from Sudan to Ethiopia, now with Ukraine and Russia. Where do you think things are going, and how do you think eyes can remain attended to events in Sudan?
I can start, if you don't mind. Let me just start by saying two things. I would like to agree with Muhsin to some extent about the fact that the issue of democratic transition in Sudan is structural. And as long as you have armed forces controlling the economy and politics, Sudan has no hope of actually becoming a democratic country. Unfortunately, this is complicated by having some regional and international players completely in bed with the local agents who are actually running their errands up and down and making sure that they're getting what they want. So we are really trapped in a complicated web of interests. It's basically Sudanese people, again, is so many odds. However, on the other side, I think the revolution is really deeply rooted in people's minds and lives and hearts at this point. It's the question for Sudanese people at this point, it's about existence. It's not really about the change itself. It's an existential dilemma. And history told us when there is a people who really want to live, and they will find a way. However, I have to be also realistic and say the slow, complete withdrawal of the state from people's life in terms of services, in terms of, the state has three main reasons: is to maintain order, enforce contract, and organize society. So the state is not doing any of this at this point. It doesn't control violence, and it cannot stop other people from inflicting it on other people. As we speak, Darfur is becoming...
I want to give everyone a chance before we close.
Thank you.
Nisreen?
I think I just want to say a quick word about investments, because we didn't really talk about this. I think one of the things to be aware of is that neoliberal investment has been sort of almost fetishized as a way to stabilize Sudan, as a way to kind of pull it out of kind of a political and economic crisis. And in a country where the majority of the people still rely on agriculture, in part at least, to make a living, I think it's really important to think about the ways in which these kinds of investments — I study foreign land grabs, Saudi and Emirati land grabs. They own more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined. And that means that it's also undermining our food security, our food sovereignty, our sovereignty over access to water, land, and other resources, and accelerating the environmental crisis. And so I think part of what, and I'm seeing this starting to get articulated alongside the political platforms that the resistance committees have articulated as a sort of way forward, is alternatives to these forms of investment, right? That really, you can't be, on the one hand, investing in, for example, land grabs and somehow also ushering in democracy. These things don't go together. So, I think that's one of the things that I think we in the diaspora need to be also pushing against. Investment is not a panacea for the problems that we are facing. In fact, in many ways, they accelerate and exacerbate these problems that we're discussing.
Thank you for that. Dr. Sadra?
Thank you very much. 2 points. There is no legitimacy for this coup, and this should not be given by the policymakers to the military council or its souvenir council, just to say, well, that's the best that we can get at this moment. As Sudanese people inside Sudan and outside Sudan, we will not accept that. The second part, which is really important, is people-to-people support, solidarity. We stand in solidarity with the people in Ukraine, and we were grateful, as my colleague said, for those who stood in solidarity with the Sudanese revolution. But the policymakers, international community should not keep a blind eye to the development of the militias in Africa that have been supported by Russia and others, and by human trafficking in the name of controlling borders. And as we can see now, keeping a blind eye has backfired because they have the human resources and they have the money to attack other human beings. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Sure. I'll pick up from where Dr. Bakri stopped, actually, and the areas of where the state should be that he mentioned that the state is no longer capable of taking over or taking care of. I think these are the areas where the resistance committees needs to start working and enforcing the kind of law that we think will develop Sudan, that will bring us the freedom, peace, and justice that we are seeking. And that is how you move towards peaceful regime change. And I just want to mention that an issue that is mentioned largely lately is sanctions, and we know sanctions very well. We lived under sanctions since 1998. I don't know how long it was. Anyway, and the only thing, honestly, targeted or not targeted, the only thing that sanctions did is that it created momentum of support for the leadership, for al-Bashir, under the idea of patriotism and rejecting the forced interferences in national matters. We saw that even with the ICC warrant, and even lately, a few weeks ago, when the US State Department announced that they're given, $100 million to support grassroots in the UN dialogue process. First, the grassroots has rejected the UN dialogue process. So I don't know why are they saying that there is need for this support. And the second thing is that this number was just used to portray everyone who's anti-coup as a traitor. And we saw that there was a hike of those kind of messaging on the internet, on the Sudanese platforms, that saying that, oh, the Americans are giving them $100 million, they're traitors. This just creates momentum for the dictatorships, while at the same time, the money is being paid for a process that legitimizes the dictator. So that is just pointless. And I agree with Nasreen that the best thing Western governments can do for us is to stop everything that they are doing, and we can take care of the rest.
Thank you, Muzen, for that. And being this is podcast held by a group that's based in Washington, I hope those who are listening. Thank you all for everyone for their rich and informative contributions. And I turn back to Audrey.
Thank you, Ismail. I first wanted to thank Dr. Bakri, Nasreen, Muzan, Dr. Sarah for sharing these excellent insights. And thank you, Ismail, for guiding this conversation so well. I want to let everyone know that today's event is part of a larger effort by Time Up to program around Sudan, as well as many of the regional dynamics that our excellent panelists touched on, and some of which is driven by our non-resident fellow Muzan El-Nil, who we are so proud to work with. And I want to invite you to continue to follow our work on these issues, as well as the work of each of our panelists who you've heard speak here today. I've dropped their handles on Twitter in the chat on the side. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion, because these conversations are made far richer by your participation and your insightful questions. You can follow us on Twitter at TimeUpDC and also find where to follow these panelists. And you can reach out for any media requests in the future for Time Up or for Muzan at press@timeup.org. You can find this recording on our website and on our YouTube channel. And finally, a huge thank you to the Time Up team involved in making this event possible, and have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.